I wanted to talk about UX debt today, but before we get into it, I wanted to explain how I got interested into this topic. So 15 months ago, I joined MYOB, which for those that don't know it, we do accounting software for businesses in New Zealand and Australia. Well, we like to think we help businesses succeed, but basically we do accounting software and a few other things. So this is actually one of our products, which has been in the market for more than 20 years. And even if it looks outdated or old, it's incredibly flexible and powerful. Just imagine 20 years worth of features and improvements and enhancements. And some of our customers actually love it. Actually, well, some of them might love it because they've been using it for 10, 15, or 20 years already. Some of them might love it because they're accountants and they don't like change, but they still love it. So one day I was looking at it and I thought about, wait a minute, why would a function like transfer money be inside the accounts menu as opposed to the banking menu? This doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't you have transfer money inside banking? So I did what I've learned to do in this new organization that has been around for a long time. I was at a startup before, so there was no one to kind of dig deeper into what was the history of some of those decisions. But this time, I talked to a few people that have been around for 15 or 20 years. And it turns out that when they first implemented this function 15 years ago, MYOB had an agreement with a bank. So that button did two things. It actually made a real transfer of money between two accounts. And it also recorded that into your books. So for those that don't know accounting, I had no idea. It's, you have to do double entry accounting, and it's not that easy to do a transfer between two accounts, even if it sounds simple. So this button was a massive time saver for accountants. They will do the two things. The only problem, it had a risk associated with it. It's like not everyone that has access to this software should have access to do a transfer and move actual money from the company's accounts to their accounts, for example. So they have to put that function into the account section, which only admins had access to, as opposed to the banking section, which was used for by a lot of bookkeepers to do their allocation and the day-to-day bookkeeping. So fast forward, I think 7 years, they finished that agreement with the bank. So then they tried to remove that function of transferring money through the system, through the software. What happened was users complained a lot. They got used to a new way of transferring money and recording that into their books. So even if their actual transfer of money was not happening anymore, they will still find some value in doing that, that recording or that journal for them. So now we have two problems. One is they could not remove that function. They had to put it back. And second, they could have moved at that point that button into the banking section. But after 7 years of being on the other menu, that felt like a strange move and a weird change for a lot of our users. So basically, this function, 7 years later, it is still there in the accounts menu. So that got me thinking about UX debt and how some of the decisions that we made today might have an impact not only tomorrow and in our customers in the next year, but also if we are designing our products to last over time, how will they behave or how will they restrain our future choices a little bit later down the track? So I got interested into this concept of UX debt. I think the developers have been talking about technical debt for a long time, and everyone has a kind of an intuitive understanding of what technical debt is. So I was curious to explore what was UX debt, or what were people's different impressions, different experiences with UX debt. So I talked to a few different professionals. I even opened an online survey to collect different people's experiences. And I started talking about that topic. So what I got from that is I got to this definition. This is my own definition of UX debt. But I defined UX debt as suboptimal design solutions, inconsistencies, or defects that negatively affect the experience of our customers, and they could be caused by business, technical, time, or budget constraints. And UX that can go from really small defects, almost too small to matter, to really complex legacy issues that are almost too hard to tackle, and it seemed overwhelming. So this is an example of one of the first types, too small to matter. So in this case, the user, when they go from a default to a custom exchange rate, the cursor is placed at the end of that text field. That means that before they can input their exchange rate, they have to delete 7 numbers, which is the default number of decimals that we have in exchange rate, before they can actually put their numbers. This seems like a really trivial thing and a small thing, but if you're doing hundreds or thousands of invoices a day, that is actually a massive frustration. This is on the other side of the spectrum. So when we talk about access management, when I was talking about that desktop software, when it was first launched, there was only offline users. So there was only one place where you can check who had access to your company file and your books. So it was relatively easy. But then we made that application have online and online. So there was online users as well. And then after that, we added online administrators. We added file managers. Don't ask me what that is. And then we added also the option for accountants to access, manage, and give permissions and not from their practice software. So now you have to go to 5 different places to get a full picture of who has access to your books and who can see what's going on in your business. And they're all in different tech stacks. They're all in different products. And it is such a hard problem to tackle that it's been pushed and pushed. And it's still like that in the product. So it's sometimes too hard to tackle, and people or teams get overwhelmed, and nobody want to pay that UX debt because it's actually too high to solve. I also learned that there's a difference between how UX debt is created in the first place. So we had an intentional UX debt, which usually comes from something went wrong. Basically, when we were developing, we missed something or we ran out of time, and then we had UX debt as a result. Julie Zhu has actually a really good article. It could happen like that something goes wrong or we run out of time, but it could also be a sign that there's a culture of low accountability and low attention to detail in your company. So Julie Zhu actually has an article that explains how she sees ruthless prioritization. And in this article, the trade-off between quality and time, she said that if you think this feature is not worth the time to build it properly, then maybe you should not build it in the first place. So just making sure that if we decide to invest efforts in that, let's do it properly, as opposed to do a half-baked job. So there's a lot of examples out there when that's not the case, and things get quickly out of control. Even if it seems like it's unintentional UX debt, it's kind of the result of a culture that allows for that to happen. We also have intentional UX debt. So you can take up UX debt consciously and think like, oh, I'm going to do a lean experiment, MVP, I'm going to learn fast and then adjust from that. And I'm happy to throw away that code or that feature that I just built and then learn from it, and then I'll build from scratch once I've learned what I have to do. So Paul Adams, for example, explained in one of his articles that he is a previous designer and now he's in product at Intercom. As a designer, he used to think that he would prefer to wait 4 months to launch a feature and launch it properly with the right UX. But then the more and more that he's been moving into management and moving into product, he says, now my view has changed a little bit. And I would say it's probably better to launch, I would prefer now to launch in 2 months, something that it's not as refined, but at least put that value in the hands of the customers earlier. And he actually adds that if you ask customers, they probably will say that they would even want to have it in a month, if that means they would even have it a little bit less refined if that meant that they could have it in a month. So that is the opposite situation. At the same time, I think what he's thinking is still talking about, if we talk about MVPs and learning, then that's a different thing from low accountability culture. So this shouldn't be an excuse to do something half-baked and then just leave it in the product forever and not go back and iterate. The whole purpose of doing experiments and MVP is actually putting it out there and learning, and then using those learnings to improve and then do a second version or a better version of that feature. And the third way that you can create UX that it's actually, or the third type, it's actually, I think there's a little bit of it that it's inevitable. Like some things just change or get outdated over time. So this screen, when it was first designed, it shows the layout like if it was a check. Because at that time, checks were the things that where you would use to move money. So it was easier, intuitive for people to understand. And it had even a check number field in there. The thing is, right now, really, really little businesses use checks. But we tried to pay that UX debt and remove that check number field a few years ago as well on MOAB. And people complained a lot, again, because apparently some bookkeepers and accountants were using that field to put their own code for different reasons. And therefore, if we remove that field, that means the whole archive system and the whole coding system will be affected. So then you cannot predict how users will use some of the things on their own to get value. And one of the people that have been an MOAB for longer, they said it's really easy to add things to the interface, but you need to be really careful because it's really, really difficult to take things away. So once you're giving something to the customers and they're getting used to it, they will find their own ways to use it and get value from it. And then it's really difficult to first understand how they're using it and why they're using it, and therefore take anything away. You might be really making a negative impact for those. So here's my thoughts of why UX debt is so damn hard to track, to manage, and to address or quantify. It's hard because each individual issue is usually not critical, but the result is the death by 1,000 cats. So Brené Brown explains a really good metaphor to talk about trust, and he talks about a jar full of marbles, and every time that you do something positive, one marble goes into the jar, and every time that someone lies, tells a secret, or steals from you, one marble or a few marbles come out of the jar. I think of UX data as the same thing. We have a jar of trust from our customers, and every time that we don't make their life easier or make it hard unnecessarily, one of those marbles got out of the jar. And the difficult thing is it's invisible. It's impossible to know that those marbles are getting out of the jar. We only realize when that jar is empty and that customer churns and decides to move away and go to another product, but then it's too late. We can't do anything about it at that point. It's difficult, it's hard because sometimes it takes longer to create a Jira ticket than actually to fix the issue, like in the example with the cursor. And you have a designer or a product manager writing a whole specification and screenshots and explaining the whole issue, which takes much more time than actually fixing it. And not only that, but it also feels really frustrating. It's like, this should have been right the first time. Why are we even documenting this? It's hard because if it goes unchecked, it can quickly grow exponentially. So once you have 7 different ways of doing filters on a list, then designers are a bit confused, and the teams don't know which one they should be consistent with, which one they should use, and therefore they stop caring. It's so messy that they stop caring, and then that just grows unchecked. Having said that, there's nothing wrong with assuming UX debt intentionally. So if you want to buy a house, you can wait 20 years until you have enough money to just go and buy a house and get it then. Or you can get on a mortgage or a debt and move into your house now. And yes, over a period of 30 years, you probably will pay more for that house, but at the same time, you will enjoy it longer, and therefore, it might be worth it for you to get that debt and have it paid over a 30-year period. In fact, the same as with a house, debt only becomes a problem if you don't have a plan to repay it. So I really agree with Nick Finck, and he was talking about he's shocked at how many organizations ship what should be an MVP but never release the improvements or refinements. And he calls this a fire and forget mentality. I think UX debt keep accumulating interest and the cost compounds over time until it's unmanageable. So you need to rebuild the whole thing or the whole application. And I've seen so many startups and small business or small products that have been in the market for a short period of time that have gotten to a point that it's so bad and there's so much UX and technical debt that they decide to re-platform and start all over again. So make sure that if you're taking on that debt, you are aware that you have a plan to repay it, and you will allow for that, either like when is that going to be repaid. So here's some of the lessons that I've learned in this journey, learning about UX debt so far. The first one is that it's better to make the whole team responsible. So if we talk about design debt, we make it about the designers and the design team not being happy with the solution being put in front of customers. And I think it's more useful to try to talk about UX debt, experience debt, or customer debt, and really be really clear about how these inconsistencies, how these defects that seems minor are actually affecting our customers and affecting their customer experience. And you can even use things like storyboarding to communicate the frustration when your customers try to use something, and the cursor is every time they do a different invoice, it goes at the end, and they have to delete all those 7 numbers before they can input their own. The sooner you fix it, the cheaper it is. So as I said, creating a Jira ticket is sometimes more cumbersome and more time-consuming than actually fix that issue. But it's not only that, it's also the mental space that occupies in your backlog. It's also looking through the backlog. It's also prioritizing it. It's having to worry about all of that. So try to prevent UX debt, if possible, before it even happens. So in our teams, we have now a small ritual that we call the 99%. So when a developer thinks that a card is finished or a feature is finished, they will call the designer and probably the product manager as well, and they will sit side by side and make the final refinements and make sure that everything is covered and those smaller things are catched and solved before they mark anything as done. Because once it's marked as done, then it has to go through the whole prioritization cycle again. The third lesson, it actually links to some of the things some of the speakers were talking about before, about good design is good business, is if you can't put a $ to that UX debt, it's really difficult for the executives or the product managers to care about it. They have so many other things that they have to weigh things about. So if you can, make your best to put a dollar figure attached to that UX debt. One important thing is to ensure that the product manager and the executives are not comparing the cost of building something properly and the cost of delay that means, compared to an MVP, and that's it. They should be comparing it to the cost of building an MVP now and the cost of fixing it later, which sometimes includes just discarding the whole MVP and starting all over again and doing a whole rework. But also, they need to consider the fact of the call center inquiries that you will get because people don't understand how that feature works, the loss of trust and referrals that you will get from those customers that either trust you a little bit less or they already had few marbles on their trust jar and they finalized the ones that were left, and then we have customer churn. But there's also the whole change management that needs to happen. One, after a few months, that you change a feature and now decide that it works differently, and you have to communicate that, and then you get more inquiries after that. And not only that, but in our case, for example, we have to also include the marketing teams, the sales teams, get them across that change. So it's a whole change management cost that sometimes gets overlooked. And there's also the aversion to change and the negative impact that it will have in your customers that had already gotten used to that specific feature. Even if it was imperfect, now that they're familiar with it, it is really difficult to tell them, no, now this is a better way, you have to learn it again. It kind of creates that friction with them. And there's also a loss of context from your developers that were embedded in that, developing that feature in the first place, that maybe if you need to make adjustments a few months later, maybe it's not the same developers, maybe they don't remember what was the context of what was going on. There is an extra friction added there as well, and an extra time that the team need to improve on that. And it's also, I think the other important part is not only considering the whole cost, but also that cost, that interest, and that compounds, that whole debt compounds over time. So if instead of 3 months, you pay that debt 3 years later, there's a few of these costs that will be much higher because people will get more used to those features. Call center inquiries might be increasing after new people joined. And lost trust and referrals will start compiling over time. And the final lesson is that I think we need to accept that some UX debt is inevitable. And it's better not to look another way and try to think positively, but assume that will happen and have a plan to repay that, or to kind of slowly plan for regular cleanups, for example. You can have a dedicated sprint. Every 6 months, you can have a percentage of its sprints. There's different strategies that you can deal with it, but it's better to know that it's going to be there, even if you do all your best and your culture is prepared to avoid as much as that UX debt as possible. So Basecamp, for example, in their online book, Shape Up, they explain how they work in 6-week sprints, and they have 2 weeks cool-off period between each of those sprints. And within that period, it allows the team to first cool down from the whole stress of releasing a feature, but also explore new ideas for the next sprint, and pay some of that UX or tech debt. They give the developers and the UXers some time to breathe and work and worry about those things and solve those things before they can focus 100% on the next thing they have to build on the next 6 weeks. And at MYOB, we have those, you can even make it fun if you want. We have those dedicated events. So one day, every few months, we dedicate a whole day. We bring a whole group of different teams to work together and focus only for a whole day, focus only on those small things or defects that we call the 1%ers, and solve as many as possible. And at the end of the day, all of the teams feel really accomplished that they've solved all of those different things that customers have been complaining in for months about them. And I don't know how, but I think the word got out, and some of our customers and partners actually know about 1% days. And then ask, when we talk about with them in user research and things like that, when is the next 1%er? Here I have a 1%er. It's usually a 3-month project, what they say, I have no 1%er. But it's great that they have this concept, and they're excited about when the next 1%er will happen, and they will get some of the things that they've been claiming for a long time solved. So those are my 4 key lessons learned about UX debt during this journey so far. So it's better to make the whole team responsible and talk about UX experience versus design, UX or experience debt versus design debt. The sooner you fix it, the cheaper it is. So if you can avoid it altogether from happening, that's even better. Trying to quantify that UX debt in terms of dollars, and also discussing a repayment plan up front so that UX stakeholders know that they're incurring some debt and they will have to pay it at some point, and hopefully plan for it and allow for it to be paid. And finally, some UX debt is inevitable, so it's better to plan for it and have regular cleanups or even time or events to address it and make it fun if you can. So those are my lessons, but I would love to hear your own experiences with UX Dev. So if you have any that you will like to share, please post them on Twitter. And thank you for listening.